Good day everyone, my name is Desmond Bernardo. I have been working in the nuclear industry for over 20 years, specifically at Koeberg Nuclear Power Station. I've worked with many of the different game players in the power generating industry, and I have to say that I was actually really upset about an article that was written. It appeared in News 24 and it was written by Melanie Gosling, who's an environmental writer who I met back in 2006-2007 when we had the rolling blackouts and we had some issues at Koeberg with regards to the generator. She actually visited me in my studio and we had probably a 2-hour-long interview around nuclear, the situation on the power grid, etc. And I just find this article that she's written very interesting and confusing for various reasons. And I actually want to cover this article with you. I've got the article open in front of me on the computer screen, so I will just go over the statements that are made and the problems that I have with those statements based on my knowledge and experience in the industry. The heading of the article is what Eskom could have done to avoid rolling blackouts, and referring to the rolling blackouts that are happening currently just before the Christmas period. And in the first sentence she says, Eskom may have been able to avoid the current rolling blackouts had it not stopped the country's renewable energy program in its tracks 2 years ago, say energy experts. She doesn't say who these experts are, because experts they certainly are not. I can tell you that none of those people have ever worked in the power generation industry. They've never worked on a unit that actually produces electricity, and they know absolutely nothing about the power grid. In the next sentence she says Eskom would also have been able to save about 725 million a year in diesel for the emergency open cycle turbines that help keep the lights on had the extra 2,000 megawatts of wind and solar power already been on the grid as originally planned. What she forgets to mention here is that these diesel generators can actually come online when we need them. If 2,000 megawatts of wind or solar was on the grid, you would only have the solar available during the day if there is no cloud cover, and you would only have the wind power available when the wind is actually blowing. So this is a completely false statement and makes a mockery of what renewable energy versus baseload energy is. Just quickly to explain what baseload energy is. Baseload is when you run a unit continuously until you have to maintain it for either breakdown or for scheduled maintenance, which means that that unit is designed to run optimally at 100% continuously. With your peak load stations like Palmit and Drakensberg, you have a pumped storage scheme where those plants actually come online in the evenings during peak time and generate as required to maintain our grid at a 50 Hertz frequency. To explain this frequency requirement, just briefly, all our items that we use, like a computer or anything that we plug into a wall socket, operates on 50 Hertz. And those items only work optimally at 50 Hertz. The grid needs to be maintained at that frequency, and it's very important that we keep the grid stable at 50 Hertz. The moment we start to increase load, us the public, in the evenings when we come home, we call it evening peak load. It actually starts to drop the frequency on the grid, and you need to increase the output of the units, like the coal-fired power stations who load follow, to maintain that grid frequency at 50 Hertz. Wind and solar cannot do this because they are not available on demand. And it's important to understand that wind and solar are unpredictable. Solar, depending on sunshine, which we can predict more than wind because we know when it's daytime and when it becomes evening time, and we can actually plot more or less during the year when solar will produce a certain amount of load, and we can plan accordingly unless cloud cover sets in. With wind, it is completely unpredictable. So for any grid to rely on wind to save you is just imaginative thinking. All wind can do for you is when it does generate, the coal-fired power station can generate less and you can save up on your coal stockpiles. The problem is this: When that wind generator comes online without planning or any prior knowledge, what happens is the coal-fired power station has to reduce its load all of a sudden, and that equipment has to work at levels where it was not designed to work, not at optimal levels. In other words, the changes can be so rapid that you cannot plan for it. You can be at 2,000 megawatts with renewables the one moment and the next moment be at nothing. Now, for 2,000 megawatts to get ramped up from coal-fired power stations is one of the reasons why we are having so many breakages at the coal-fired power stations at the moment. The next statement that she makes is, but because Eskom stymied the renewable energy program in 2016, the first of these power plants will now come online only in 2020. This is probably one of the biggest disasters to hit the South African energy market, and to me is bigger than the arms deal scandal. The fact that people are saying that firstly we're going to get cheap wind energy, and secondly that it's going to solve our load shedding issues is a lie. Then she goes on to say, meanwhile, Eskom has budgeted another 1 billion for diesel to keep these turbines generating emergency power to reduce the risk of rolling blackouts. This is one of the most expensive forms of electricity generation. So she is using diesel, which is the most expensive, as an excuse to use another expensive item, which is wind. Why is wind expensive and why is solar expensive? For you to install 100 megawatts of wind generating power, you need to have another 100 megawatts of coal or of nuclear as baseload, because when the wind is not there, what is going to take over that load? Or you need to install 100 megawatts worth of batteries, in other words storage for that energy to be used later. And currently we do not have that. I know that Elon Musk is trying miracles throughout the world to put up battery banks that is supposed to help us. They are costing an absolute fortune for an item that cannot be validated economically. She goes on to say that the SA Wind Energy Association said if Eskom had signed power purchase agreements in 2016, another 2,000 megawatts of renewable energy would now be contributing to the South African power supply while also avoiding diesel costs. What they are not saying is that of the 2,000 megawatts, if that was all wind, it would only be available 30% of the time, if you are lucky. So that would mean 600 megawatts at any given point in time would be available from wind, not 2,000 megawatts. Where a baseload power station, if you have 2,000 megawatts on the grid, you are getting 2,000 megawatts indefinitely, day in, day out, until you get a breakage. Energy expert and engineer Tobias Bischoff-Nims, who established the Energy Center at the CSIR, went further and said in a tweet, she's referring to tweets in an article, that if Eskom had not stopped the implementation of very cheap solar, photovoltaic and wind energy power projects, it would very likely not have to burn any diesel right now, nor would it have to load shed. If Eskom had finished more of the units of Mdupi or Kusile, they would actually have baseload. If we started building extra nuclear units or extra coal units back in 1998, like the energy paper at the time said, we would not even have to think about renewable energy. Now let's look at the cost of renewable energy. The cheapest cost estimate for wind at this stage is 62 cents per kilowatt hour. This is not what they are selling at to Eskom at the moment. In fact, they are selling at cost more than 10 times that to Eskom at the moment, fixed into contracts for 20 years. In other words, Eskom has to be the cash cow for all of these renewable projects. What they're not telling the public is that Eskom now has to fund these renewable projects and actually be the subsidy for them. That a lot of the price increases that we've received is directly because of renewables. And I agree with the previous CEO, Matsela Koko, when he said that we should not sign these IPPs up because we just, as a country, cannot afford it. And who is best to benefit from these projects at this stage? I leave a big question mark on that one at the moment. She goes further on to quote Bischoff to say the existing renewables are helping, but more of them would help more. What kind of a scientific statement is this from someone that works at the CSIR? He actually works for a renewable energy company in Germany. He worked at Eskom as a chief engineer and a system operator before he moved to the CSIR. He should know that Germany has on one day produced all their power from renewable energy. And at that moment, in that day, when they started producing all the energy from renewables, what they don't tell you is that 5 minutes later, they were only producing 10% renewable energy. And most of the rest of the energy had to come from France and from other places in Europe and from coal-fired power stations. At the moment, renewable energy has not reduced the carbon emissions anywhere in the world. That is a separate topic. But the targets that they've put out, that renewable energy will reduce carbon emissions, is a fallacy and a lie. Because you know that there needs to be coal-fired power stations or nuclear power stations as baseload to actually contribute to when these unreliable energy sources are coming onto the national grid. Brenda Martin, CEO of SAWEA, said the extra 2,000 megawatts of renewable energy would have displaced 725 million in Eskom diesel cost every year. Once again, they have to justify renewable energy with diesel costs. We could have done so much to either have maintained the coal-fired power station units that we currently have, that's already built, that's already paid for, that is supplying energy at just over 40 cents a kilowatt hour, some of them. Kuburg supplying energy at 38 cents a kilowatt hour. And we are currently purchasing renewable energy at more than 4 rand, some of them 6 rand a kilowatt hour. How is this justified? In the current economy we find ourselves in a third world economy where most of the people are struggling and just battling to keep bread on the table. If I carry on and look at the rest of the lies in the article, you look at people talking about the renewable energy projects, how it would inject 55.92 billion of direct investment, create over 60,000 jobs only during manufacturing, because they know that there's no jobs when those wind turbines are set up. There's no jobs at all. Nothing to speak of in any case. So to me, at this stage, it's important for you to understand one thing. We supply energy onto a national grid. All the different IPPs, Eskom, whoever we get power from, Mozambique, Kaurabasa, supplies energy into a national power grid. This power grid distributes that energy to us, the customers, which could be industry, it could be home use, whatever. That power grid needs to be kept stable. It is not about what you want to supply the grid. If you want to pay for renewable energy, be my guest. And I'm not against wind or solar power. I'm against what it does to the grid. I'm against what it does to the coal-fired power stations currently that are old, that needs to be retired soon, that have to ramp up and ramp down to compensate for the renewable energy projects just coming in uncontrolled and unscheduled. This is currently what the Eskom grid has to deal with. And people wonder why these power stations are breaking down, especially the coal-fired power stations. And I have to agree with Ted Blom that if we could, that we should have rather built extra nuclear power station units and actually built an industry around that. A technological industry, and that we should have gone and actually made sure that we don't need these expensive renewable projects on a large scale. I do recommend that people go and become energy independent. So at your home, put up solar panels, put up a wind turbine, spend the cost on having a battery bank, because if you don't have a battery bank, you actually become part of the problem. That means that during the day you're using the solar energy for your home, and at night you depend on the national grid again, which means that you add to the peak. So I just want to make clear that people understand that if you don't do things correctly, that you will actually end up helping to break the system and cause the rolling blackouts. I thank you.